How do you sort out the so-called jargon from real-world practices that work? Do the members of your organization find some business or technology advice utterly confusing? Welcome to Real Talk with Sam Holcman. In this program, we set the record straight, and in terms that business people and technology people can understand. Now, here is your host, Sam Holcman.
Welcome to this edition of Real Talk. I'm Sam Holcman, and the topic for today is an extremely timely topic. And it was generated by, my interest was generated by an article June 22nd in the Wall Street Journal titled, "Canada Passes Law Forcing Facebook, Google to Pay Media for Links." And the subheading is, digital platforms have warned legislation could force them to block, restrict access to news stories for Canadian users. And I'm going to read part of this article and then I'm going to comment on it. Canada's Parliament approved legislation to compel digital companies to compensate domestic media outlets for links to their articles, a move Facebook said would force it to block access to news reports on its platform for Canadian users, as it did 2 years ago in Australia. Google, owned by Alphabet, also has signaled possible restrictions of news content on its search function in Canada as a result of the legislation. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said the government wouldn't back down and accused Facebook, a unit of Meta Platforms, and Google of deploying bullying tactics to get their way. It's not going to work, Trudeau said this month. Legislation passage Thursday marks the second time in roughly 3 months Canada's Parliament has endorsed new measures to regulate activity in the digital field, irking leading technology companies that worry other countries might mimic Ottawa's approach. Ottawa passed legislation in April that would order streaming platforms like Netflix and YouTube to feature more Canadian content to users in that country. The new law passed by Canada's Senate requires digital platforms to strike commercial deals with news publishers, which incorporate print, online, and broadcast medias, for their content. The goal is to provide media outlets with a financial lifeline to offset the loss of advertising revenue that has migrated to the digital sphere. Should negotiations fail, the legislation calls for the two sides to enter binding arbitration to determine appropriate compensation. Here's what I need to say at this point. It's about time. I'm a small company. We are a small company. We generate intellectual property, just like these news media outlets do. We need to be compensated for that. So I applaud Mr. Trudeau in his efforts, and I hope he succeeds. I'm not suggesting that Google, Facebook, and others should pay X dollars, where X is some number that may be detrimental to them. But let me state it differently. Paying $0 for this content is not correct. Just like the streaming music platforms are paying the authors of music, and just like the video platforms are paying their authors for that intellectual property and content, well, guess what? Google, Meta, Facebook, and, by the way, ChatGPT, Bard, and all the other AI engines should be doing the same thing. It is time that we have a bit of understanding that these outlets are pipes. Let me repeat, they're pipes. And what makes a difference is what goes through the pipes, which is the intellectual property. It doesn't make sense for the pipe providers to be getting all of the revenue. It just doesn't make any sense. They are pipe suppliers. So I agree with Mr. Trudeau. It seems like it's a bullying tactic. But let's take a deep breath for a moment. I think it's important. I want to make it clear what I'm saying is there needs to be a negotiated compensation for intellectual property. It's intellectual property that is being used. And the pipe suppliers are making 100% of the revenues. Well, let's figure out what an adequate amount of sharing should be in that particular platform. And it's high time for this to happen. And I want to extend this. Mr. Trudeau, please also consider extending this understanding to the AI engines that are doing the exact same thing, using copyrighted information that is owned by others to train their engines. That also needs to be addressed. And I hope at this point there will be some movement in this direction. Yes, I use Google. Yes, I use Meta platforms. I think they're fine platforms. I do think it's high time that we figure out that there needs to be some sharing of revenues, because these organizations are using that information for their benefit, and it's time that the people that provide the intellectual property get some compensation for their benefit. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for tuning into Real Talk. Be sure to join your host, Sam Holcman, again for another edition of our program. We'll have more real topics of discussion then.